He was one of the Habsburg dynasty's most brilliant technical minds, a genius inventor prince who forged the artillery power of an entire empire. He commanded the rank of general, opulent palaces, and a military legacy respected across Europe. Yet, he was disowned by his own country. He was stripped of every title, every property, and all honors by the Habsburg Law. He died as a nameless commoner on the streets of Vienna, watching his life's work turn to ash. His name was Archduke Leopold Salvator. Why was one of the dynasty's greatest innovators erased and forgotten by the very empire he served? He was born on a crisp October morning in 1863 in Alt-Bunzlau, Bohemia. The world he entered was a magnificent yet teetering edifice. This was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a sprawling multi-ethnic mosaic of cultures, languages, and religions, all held together by the ancient authority of his relative, Emperor Franz Joseph I. It was an era of profound contradiction. Horse-drawn carriages clattered down cobblestone streets past the flickering glow of new gas lamps, and the first rumblings of industrialization were beginning to transform societies that had remained unchanged for centuries. Beneath the grand facade of Viennese high society and imperial power, the cracks were already beginning to show. Nationalism was simmering in Hungary, Bohemia, and the Balkans, and the rigid traditions of the Habsburg court often felt like a relic from another age. Into this magnificent, fragile world, Leopold Salvator stood out. He wasn't just another archduke destined for a ceremonial military command. He was an engineer, an artillery general, and above all, an inventor whose innovations would modernize military equipment in ways few could have predicted. Yet today, his name barely registers in the annals of history. Why? Because his life, though marked by astonishing ingenuity, became a poignant testament to the human cost of geopolitical upheaval. This is the story of an inventor prince who lost his empire, his home, and his fortune, leaving behind a legacy of brilliance that was almost entirely erased by the very history he tried to shape. Leopold's unique path was, in many ways, set by his lineage. He was a member of the Tuscan branch of the Habsburgs, a line known for being more intellectually curious, liberal, and less rigidly formal than the main line of the dynasty in Vienna. His father, Archduke Karl Salvator, and his mother, Princess Maria Immaculata of Bourbon-Two Sicilies, fostered an environment that encouraged intellectual pursuits over mere courtly etiquette. Their children, including Leopold's scholarly older brother Ludwig, were given an education that nurtured their natural inclinations. For young Leopold, this was a godsend. He wasn't drawn to the rigid drilling of the parade ground. He was captivated by how things worked. He possessed a natural, restless aptitude for mathematics and physics. While other young royals were mastering protocol, Leopold was mastering calculus. This was no gentleman's hobby. It was a serious academic pursuit. He went on to earn a Doctor of Science degree and was formally inducted as a member of the Academy of Science, Literature, and Fine Arts in Prague. This wasn't a ceremonial title gifted to a royal. It was a genuine recognition of his early proven talent for engineering and innovation. But Leopold's passion wasn't confined to textbooks and academies. His adventurous spirit demanded practical application. In an era when the gentleman scientist was a common trope, Leopold was the real article, and he was drawn to one of the most daring, cutting-edge, and dangerous pursuits of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, ballooning. Today we see hot air balloons as a gentle, romantic pastime. In Leopold's time, it was the absolute frontier of technology and human exploration, the equivalent of the space race. It was a perilous dance with aerodynamics, meteorology, and the sheer terror of the unknown. Imagine the excitement, the sheer audacious novelty of soaring above the landscape in a fragile wicker basket, suspended beneath a giant gas-filled fabric sphere. Leopold wasn't just an enthusiast, he was a pioneer. In 1902, he undertook a remarkable record-breaking flight. He ascended in the balloon Meteor from Salzburg, and in a mere 4 hours, traversed the breathtaking, treacherous alpine landscape all the way to the majestic Dachstein Mountains. This was no leisurely afternoon excursion. It was a significant feat of early aviation, a flight that pushed the boundaries of altitude, distance, and navigation. It demonstrated not only his profound adventurous spirit, but also his deep technical understanding of aerodynamics, wind currents, and the emerging science of meteorology. While the Wright brothers were still a year away from their historic flight at Kitty Hawk, tinkering with wings and engines on the shores of the Atlantic, Archduke Leopold Salvator was already a master of the skies, quietly pushing the boundaries of flight within the heart of Europe. His early prestige was cemented by the numerous honors bestowed upon him. He was a knight of the Order of the Golden Fleece, one of the oldest and most prestigious orders of chivalry in the world. He held the Order of St. Hubert and the Black Eagle from his German cousins, and even the Order of the White Eagle from Serbia, a nation that would soon play a fateful role in the future of his empire. In these early golden years, Archduke Leopold Salvator was a man at the pinnacle of European royalty, respected for his ancient lineage, but more uniquely celebrated for his formidable intellect. He was the perfect synthesis of the old world and the new, a prince with the mind of an engineer, a Habsburg who was quite literally reaching for the clouds. But this idyllic life of science and privilege was about to be grounded by the two great forces that define any human life: love and family. This pioneering spirit, who was already mastering the skies, was soon grounded by the most profound of earthly responsibilities. While his mind was dedicated to the future, his heart was bound by a duty as old as his dynasty: marriage. His union with Infanta Blanca de Bourbon would not only forge a powerful dynastic alliance with Spain's Carlist pretenders, but would also build a vast, opulent family life that stood as the very pinnacle of imperial grandeur, a world of palaces and privilege that would soon be balanced by his other, grittier responsibilities. In 1889, at the age of 26, Leopold Salvator's life of intellectual pursuits and aeronautical adventures became anchored by a union that would shape the rest of his existence. He married Infanta Blanca de Bourbon, a woman of formidable character and a lineage as royal and arguably more tumultuous than his own. This was not merely a marriage of love, it was a dynastic alliance of immense significance, binding the Habsburgs to one of the most famously stubborn and unyielding royal factions in all of Europe. To understand Blanca, one must understand her father. She was the eldest daughter of Carlos, Duke of Madrid, the man known to his followers as Carlos VII. He was the Carlist pretender to the Spanish throne. Carlism was not just a simple claim. It was a powerful, deeply ideological and militant political movement that had torn Spain apart in a series of bloody civil wars. The Carlists were ultra-traditionalists. They stood for a vision of Spain that was, even then, a throwback to a bygone era: absolute monarchy, the unshakable authority of the Catholic Church, and a fierce rejection of liberalism, parliamentarism, and modernity in all its forms. They were, in essence, royalist rebels, and Carlos, Duke of Madrid, was their king in exile. Blanca was raised in this crucible of belief. She was not brought up to be a mere princess. She was raised as the daughter of a man who believed himself to be the true king of Spain, unjustly denied his birthright. Her childhood was not one of stable luxury, but of exile, political maneuvering, and a profound, almost religious sense of dynastic duty. She was a woman of iron will, unshakable Catholic faith, and a deep-seated belief in the divine right of kings. Where Leopold Salvator's mind was analytical, inventive, and forward-looking, Blanca's was principled, devout, and rooted in the unwavering traditions of the past. Their union was a fascinating one. The slightly more liberal, scientifically minded Tuscan branch of the Habsburgs was joining with the most defiantly traditionalist line of Spanish Bourbon. Yet by all accounts, the marriage was a success. It was a fruitful and, it appears, genuinely affectionate partnership, blessed with 10 children over the next 2 decades. Dolores Immaculata, Margarita Rainer, Leopold Jr., Maria Antonia, Anton, Assunta, Franz Joseph, and Karl Pius. This large, bustling family became the center of Leopold's world, and their life was a portrait of the sheer, unimaginable scale of imperial wealth in the last days of the Belle Époque. Their existence was spread across a portfolio of properties that today would seem impossibly grand. Their primary residence in the capital was the magnificent Palais Toscana in Vienna. Located on the Argentinierstrasse, it was a grand city palace, a stone's throw from the Belvedere Palace and not far from the Hofburg, the very heart of imperial power. This was their public-facing home, a place of formal receptions and high society obligations, where Leopold and Blanca would represent their branch of the family during the glittering Viennese court season. It was a world of polished marble floors, soaring frescoed ceilings, and a constant quiet hum of activity. But the family's heart, it seems, was outside the city. They owned the sprawling Schloss Wilhelminenburg, a vast palace set on the rolling wooded hills overlooking Vienna. This was their escape, a place where the 10 children could run with more freedom than the formal gardens of the city allowed. It was a place of fresh air, breathtaking views, and a slightly more relaxed protocol. One can easily imagine Leopold, free from his formal duties, using the expansive grounds to think, sketch his inventions, or simply be a father. Then there was the true seat of their landed wealth, Castle Herrnstein. Located in Lower Austria, this was not just a home, it was a dominion. The castle itself, a formidable structure, sat at the center of 9,000 acres of forest and farmland. This was the traditional source of aristocratic power, the land itself. It was a place for hunting, a core ritual of royal life, and for managing the vast estates that provided a significant portion of their income. Finally, there was their cherished refuge from the cold Austrian winters, La Tenuta Reale, the royal estate, and another charming villa in Viareggio, Italy. This connection to Italy was deep. Leopold was, after all, a Habsburg of the Tuscan line, and his mother was a Bourbon Two Sicilies. Viareggio, on the sun-drenched Tuscan coast, was their haven. It was a place of sea air, pines, and respite from the suffocatingly rigid protocol of the Viennese court. Here they were less Archduke and Infanta and more Papa and Mama. It was at Viareggio that the family's bonds were forged, a place of warm memories that would stand in stark contrast to the bitter years of exile that were to come. This entire continent-spanning lifestyle was made possible by a retinue of 80 servants. It is difficult in the 21st century to truly comprehend what this means. This was not a staff, it was a small army, a fully self-contained ecosystem dedicated to the comfort and management of a single family. There were valets for the Archduke and ladies-in-waiting for the Archduchess. A legion of governesses and tutors were required for the 10 children, each responsible for a different aspect of their education. One for languages, one for music, one for mathematics. There were chambermaids, footmen, and laundresses, a kitchen staff large enough to cater a state banquet at a moment's notice, led by a high-strung chef, stable hands to manage the dozens of horses for carriages and riding, and groundskeepers for each of the vast estates. Leopold's life was a meticulously scheduled operation, moving from palace to castle to villa with the precision of a military maneuver. Yet, amidst this almost overwhelming grandeur, he remained by all accounts a devoted father. He found genuine joy and solace in his large brood. While Emperor Franz Joseph, his kinsman, was a famously remote and duty-bound figure, Leopold was known to be more present, more engaged, and more human. Nothing captures this hidden side of his personality better than a rare, surviving photograph. The image is both charming and completely unexpected. It shows the Archduke, a serious-looking man in formal attire, the future Inspector General of Artillery, playfully interacting with a baby bear. In a world where every public-facing gesture was freighted with meaning, this image is a delightful anomaly. It reveals a lighter, whimsical side to a man often defined by his technical mind and his military rank. It shows a man capable of genuine, spontaneous play, a hidden warmth, and perhaps a love for the natural world that few outside his immediate circle ever saw. It is a profoundly humanizing glimpse of the man behind the stiff collar and the myriad of titles. This was the world of Archduke Leopold Salvator at the turn of the 20th century, a life of perfect balanced contradictions. He was a prince of the blood and a peer-reviewed scientist. He was a dutiful husband to a hyper-traditionalist wife and a forward-thinking inventor. He was a stern military officer and a playful father who kept a bear as a pet. His life was a symphony of privilege, intellect, and family joy. But this world, this idyllic, opulent, and meticulously ordered world of 10 children, 80 servants, and 4 palaces, was built on a foundation that was already beginning to fracture. The very children they were raising in this bubble of imperial privilege, the children who knew only palaces and private villas, would soon be scattered across continents, their lives defined not by royal protocol, but by revolution, war, and the desperate struggle to survive. The coming century would not be kind to the House of Habsburg, and the gathering storm, still just a dark cloud on the Balkan horizon, would soon stretch across all of their lives, engulfing them in a deluge that would wash their entire world away. But life for Archduke Leopold Salvator was not just a cycle of lavish balls and idyllic family retreats between Vienna and Viareggio. Behind the closed doors of his workshops and on the military proving grounds, the Archduke was leading a second, more urgent life. The man who was a devoted father to 10 children was also a general whose true passion was not the parade ground, but the engine. As Inspector General of Artillery, he would apply his formidable engineering mind to a single critical task, modernizing the ancient creaking war machine of the Habsburg Empire, a task that would prove essential for its survival. Archduke Leopold Salvator was not merely born into the military. He actively, restlessly, and brilliantly sought to reshape it. In an empire defined by its rigid traditions, where military rank was often a matter of birth rather than ability, Leopold was a profound anomaly. He was not a parade general, a royal figurehead content to review troops in a resplendent uniform. He was an engineer in a general's tunic, a scientist with supreme command, and his true passion lay not in the pomp of the parade ground, but in the grease of the machine shop and the complex mathematics of a firing solution. His career as Inspector General of Artillery in the Austro-Hungarian Empire was the culmination of a life spent in uniform, but it was his relentless drive for innovation that truly defined his service. To understand his impact, one must first understand the behemoth he was trying to change. The Kaiserliche und Königliche Armee, Imperial and Royal Army. The Austro-Hungarian army was less a single unified force and more a sprawling complex mosaic, much like the empire itself. Its soldiers spoke over a dozen languages: German, Hungarian, Czech, Polish, Ukrainian, Croatian, Slovene, and more. A single regiment might require its officers to give commands in 3 different tongues. While fiercely loyal to the emperor, the army was often technologically backward compared to its rising aggressive neighbors, particularly the German Empire. It was an army where cavalry charges were still drilled with religious fervor, while the German general staff was busy planning troop movements on intricate railroad timetables. Into this traditionalist institution stepped Archduke Leopold Salvator. He had risen through the ranks, his technical acumen earning him a grudging and then admiration-filled respect from the career officers. He didn't just visit garrisons, he inspected their workshops. He didn't just observe maneuvers, he critiqued their logistical failures and proposed new solutions. He saw with the clear eyes of an engineer that the next war would not be won by dashing hussars, but by the relentless mathematical precision of artillery and the grinding, unstoppable power of the machine. His appointment as Inspector General of Artillery placed him at the very nexus of this impending transformation. It was a role he seemed born to play, and he attacked its challenges with a storm of creative energy. His most groundbreaking and enduring contribution was born from a simple mud-caked problem. Cannons were heavy, and horses, the traditional prime movers of artillery, struggled to pull them across the unpaved, often boggy, terrain of rural Europe. An artillery battery stuck in the mud was not just delayed, it was useless, a sitting duck for the enemy. Leopold's inventive mind saw a solution, not in stronger horses, but in a new kind of machine. He developed a groundbreaking 4-wheel drive system. This was a revolutionary concept at a time when almost all nascent automobiles were powered by a single axle. Leopold's design allowed an engine's power to be distributed to all 4 wheels, giving a vehicle a tenacious mountain goat-like grip. He patented the system, a highly unusual move for a man of his station, and its effectiveness was so obvious that it was quickly adopted by the industrial giant Škoda for their new line of heavy artillery tractors. These were monstrous, powerful machines, and they were a direct result of the Archduke's genius. Where horse teams would founder, these all-wheel drive tractors could haul the heaviest siege guns into position, fundamentally changing the speed and flexibility of the army. He didn't stop there. He championed all-wheel drive motorization for the entire armed forces, understanding that logistics, the ability to move men, bullets, and bread to the front, was just as important as strategy. But his mind was not limited to transport. As Inspector General, his primary focus was the guns themselves. He was instrumental in refining mine and torpedo technology for the KUK Kriegsmarine. The Austro-Hungarian Navy, though often overshadowed by its German and British counterparts, was a powerful force tasked with controlling the Adriatic Sea. Leopold understood that the tight, island-filled confines of the Adriatic were a perfect environment for naval mines and the new self-propelled torpedoes. His refinements made these weapons more reliable and more deadly, creating a fortress of interlocking minefields and torpedo boat bases that would keep the Italian and French navies largely at bay for much of the coming war. He also leveraged his own hard-won experience as an aviator. When he looked at his balloons, he saw more than a sportsman's hobby. He saw the future of his own branch. He was one of the first high-ranking officers in any army to grasp the profound tactical marriage between aviation and artillery. He championed the use of balloons and later the first flimsy biplanes for aerial reconnaissance. From a basket suspended 1,000 feet in the air, an observer with a map and a telephone line, or signal flags, could see what no cavalry scout ever could: the exact location of enemy trenches, the hidden massing of troops, and most importantly, the precise location of enemy artillery batteries. This was the holy grail for a gunner. It was Leopold who pushed for the creation of dedicated aerial spotting units, helping to lay the groundwork for a doctrine that would come to define the battlefields of the 20th century: the eyes in the sky guiding the guns on the ground. His 1902 balloon ascent wasn't just a record breaker, it was the research and development phase of a future military strategy. He was also a pragmatist. Some sources credit him with being among the first to understand and implement the tactical use of dynamite in warfare. Nitroglycerin-based explosives were powerful but unstable. Dynamite, Nobel's invention, made that power stable and portable. Leopold saw its potential beyond its civilian applications in mining and construction. He explored its use for rapid battlefield demolitions, destroying bridges and railways to deny them to the enemy, and for breaching the new, formidable concrete fortifications that were replacing old stone castles. He was, in essence, developing the tools and techniques that would become the domain of the modern combat engineer. These were not just theoretical musings or pet projects. Leopold's technical patents were so effective and so commercially viable that they generated a significant personal income. This fact alone set him worlds apart from his royal cousins. While they lived entirely on imperial stipends and the income from their vast inherited lands, Leopold Salvator was, in part, a self-made man. He was an aristocrat who earned a salary from his own intellect, a prince who cashed royalty checks not from his subjects, but from his own patented ideas. This income stream born of his modern meritocratic mind would prove to be a critical financial lifeline when the ancient land-based wealth of his dynasty evaporated into thin air. His innovations were not just for personal gain, they were part of a desperate empire-wide race against time. As the 1900s gave way to the 1910s, the atmosphere in Europe was growing heavy and electric. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913, which saw the Ottoman Empire virtually ejected from Europe and the smaller Balkan states turn on each other, were a brutal dress rehearsal for what was to come. Leopold Salvator, in his capacity as Inspector General, would have been deeply involved in the aftermath. He would have studied the reports from the front, noting how modern artillery, supplied by French and German firms to the Serbs and Bulgarians, had shattered old fortifications. He would have read with intense interest how machine guns had dominated the battlefield. These lessons would have lent a terrible urgency to his work. He was a modern man, a man of science and logic, trying to arm a medieval empire. He was desperately trying to forge a 20th century shield for a 19th century body politic. His focus on developing and deploying his new tractors, his improved guns, his mines, and his torpedoes was not an intellectual exercise. It was a race to prepare the Austro-Hungarian military for the war that was surely coming. He was a prince, a general, and an engineer, fighting for an empire that was, even then, slowly crumbling beneath his feet. As the summer of 1914 approached, Archduke Leopold Salvator stood as one of the most respected and genuinely brilliant figures in the Habsburg monarchy. His air force and motorized units built on his vision were the most modern parts of the army. He had given his emperor the best tools his mind could invent. The race to modernize the army, which Leopold had championed with such urgency, was not an abstract exercise. The revolutionary four-wheel drive tractors, the new artillery doctrines, and the refined torpedoes were all being prepared for a purpose. In 1914, in the fires of Sarajevo, that purpose was brutally ignited. The war that was surely coming was now here, and the theories and patents of the Inventor Prince were about to be tested in the most catastrophic crucible imaginable. As the world plunged into the maelstrom of the Great War, Leopold Salvator was thrust to the epicenter, his genius now a critical factor on three separate bloody fronts. The shots that rang out in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, were not just an act of political assassination. They were the starting gun for the destruction of a world. When the Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip murdered Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Leopold Salvator's kinsman, and his wife Sophie, he set in motion a catastrophic automated sequence of events. The July crisis that followed was a month-long diplomatic train wreck of ultimatums, mobilizations, and intersecting alliances. By the first week of August, the continent was ablaze. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had declared war on Serbia, which in turn brought in Russia. Germany, bound to Austria, declared war on Russia and its ally, France. When Germany invaded Belgium to outflank the French, Great Britain declared war on Germany. The great multi-ethnic traditionalist empires, Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary, had all, in a fit of collective suicidal arrogance, plunged Europe into a maelstrom. For Archduke Leopold Salvator, the abstract theories and workshop tinkering were over. He was no longer just an inventor. He was the inspector general of artillery for an empire now fighting for its very survival. The war, which the generals had confidently predicted would be over by Christmas, immediately bogged down into a form of industrialized slaughter that no one had anticipated, except perhaps a few prescient engineers like Leopold himself. He was at the epicenter of the colossal challenge. The Austro-Hungarian army was immediately forced to fight on two and then three massive fronts. First, there was the Eastern Front against the vast, seemingly endless steamroller of the Russian Empire. This was a war of movement and mud across the plains of Galicia in modern-day Poland and Ukraine. Here, Leopold's innovations were put to their first brutal test. His Škoda artillery tractors, born of his four-wheel drive patents, were no longer just a technological novelty. They were the only reliable way to move the army's heavy siege howitzers across the boggy, rain-soaked fields and shattered roads. While horse teams collapsed and died by the thousand, Leopold's machines, his iron horses, proved their worth, dragging the heavy guns into position to support the beleaguered infantry. Second, there was the Balkan front against Serbia. What was meant to be a swift, punitive expedition turned into a humiliating, bloody slog. The small, battle-hardened Serbian army threw the Austrians back 3 times, inflicting terrible casualties. Leopold's artillery was called upon to blast a path that the infantry could not seem to force, a grim preview of the war's dominant, brutal tactic. Then, in 1915, a new front opened, one that was arguably the most brutal of the entire war, the Italian front. Italy, betraying its former alliance with Austria and Germany, declared war in a bid to seize territory. This front was a waking nightmare. It was not fought in trenches of mud, but in trenches of solid rock and ice, high in the Julian Alps. Here, soldiers fought at 10,000 feet, in temperatures that froze rifles solid, and where the slightest wound meant a slow death from exposure. This was where Leopold Salvator's engineering acumen was needed most. This was an artillery war in 3 dimensions. Guns had to be dismantled, hauled by mules and his new tractors up seemingly impossible mountain paths, and reassembled on tiny ledges overlooking Italian positions. His experience with explosives and dynamite was now in deadly, constant demand. His combat engineers used it to blast gun emplacements out of sheer cliffsides and, most terrifyingly, to wage Minnenkrieg, mine warfare. Both sides began tunneling under each other's mountaintop positions, packing the tunnels with thousands of pounds of explosives and literally blowing the tops of mountains, and the men on them, into oblivion. Leopold was not a distant commander. As Inspector General, he was relentlessly active, personally overseeing critical operations and bringing his genius to bear. He didn't just sign orders, he solved problems. He was constantly on the move between fronts, reforming and leading artillery units, applying his engineering mind directly to the grim mathematical realities of the battlefield. He oversaw the steel storm that became the defining feature of the war. His guns were the new gods of the battlefield. They were responsible for over 70% of all casualties. His improved torpedoes and mines, which he had refined in peacetime, now kept the Austro-Hungarian Navy's back door on the Adriatic sealed, bottling up the Italian fleet. His aerial observers in the balloons and rickety biplanes he had championed were the eyes of the army, circling over the jagged peaks of the Alps and the muddy plains of Galicia, calling down fire on targets they and only they could see. It was a terrible, tragic irony. Leopold Salvator was a man of science, a creative and curious mind who had once delighted in the simple joy of flight and the playful company of a baby bear. Now he was a key architect of destruction on an unimaginable scale. Every one of his brilliant innovations was now a cog in a vast machine of death. His four-wheel drive system hauled guns that pulverized villages. His aerial observation techniques directed barrages that annihilated entire regiments. His expertise in explosives was used to entomb men alive inside mountains. He fought for an empire that was, even as he applied his genius to its defense, dying of 1,000 internal cuts. The Austro-Hungarian army, despite the bravery of its soldiers, was a logistical basket case. Men at the front often had no boots, no food, and not enough bullets. The patchwork of nationalities, which had been a charming mosaic in peacetime, became a catastrophic liability in war. Czechs and Poles, forced to fight for a German-speaking emperor against their Russian, Slavic brothers, began to desert or mutiny in growing numbers. In November 1916, the one unifying symbol of the empire, the ancient Emperor Franz Joseph, died after a 68-year reign. He was succeeded by Leopold's kinsman, the young, idealistic, and tragic Archduke Karl I. But it was too late. The empire was exhausted, it was starving, broke, and being bled white on 4 fronts. Leopold Salvator, the prince engineer, did everything he could. He used his science to give the dying empire a fighting chance, to modernize an army that was struggling against the relentless tide of history. His inventions and his leadership did alter tactical approaches and gave the Austro-Hungarian forces a crucial, if ultimately insufficient, edge. He was a prince, a general, and an engineer, fighting with 20th century tools for a 19th century empire that was, by 1918, collapsing in real time. In the fall of 1918, it was all over. The army, shattered by the final Italian offensive at Vittorio Veneto, simply disintegrated. Soldiers of all nationalities dropped their rifles and began walking home to countries that no longer existed and new ones that were just being born. On November 11th, 1918, Emperor Karl I, facing total collapse, renounced participation in state affairs. The war was over. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, an entity that had shaped Central Europe for 600 years, was gone. It vanished from the map. For Archduke Leopold Salvator, this was not just a military defeat. It was the end of his world. He was no longer a general because his army no longer existed. He was no longer an archduke because his title had been abolished. He was no longer one of the wealthiest men in Europe because his properties were about to be seized. He was a 55-year-old man, a brilliant inventor, and a prince. And he had just lost his empire, his home, and his entire reason for being. For 4 years, Leopold Salvator applied every fiber of his intellect to the defense of his empire, his innovations providing a vital modern edge to an ancient army. But in 1918, the machine of war that he had worked so tirelessly to perfect finally ground to a halt, and the empire he served simply ceased to exist. The end of the war did not bring peace for the Archduke. It brought a new, more personal kind of destruction. The general who had commanded armies would now face his greatest challenge, a humiliating peace, a vindictive new law, and a fall from grace so complete it would see a prince of the blood attempt to sell groceries just to survive. The end of the war did not bring peace. For Archduke Leopold Salvator and his family, it brought a new kind of war, a war for survival, waged not with artillery, but with laws, ledgers, and the crushing weight of public opinion. In 1919, the newly formed Republic of German Austria, desperate to exorcise the ghosts of its imperial past, passed a vindictive and deeply personal piece of legislation, the Habsburg Law, Habsburger Gesetz. This law was a brutal ideological cudgel. It banished all members of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine from Austrian territory forever. Their entire vast centuries-old portfolio of properties, the palaces, the castles, the hunting lodges, the art collections, all the vast wealth tied to the crown, was seized by the state. There was, however, a loophole, a poison pill designed to break the dynasty's pride. Any Habsburg who formally and in writing renounced all of their titles, privileges, and claims to the defunct throne would be allowed to remain in Austria, not as royalty, but as a simple private citizen. The Habsburgs were split. Some pragmatic and exhausted signed the paper. They gave up their heritage to keep their homes. But Archduke Leopold Salvator, a man defined by his lineage and his wife Infanta Blanca, the daughter of a Carlist pretender who had lived her entire life for a royal claim, could not. It was a principle they would not and could not compromise. For Leopold, a man of unwavering principles and a deep, almost physical attachment to his heritage, renouncing his name was unthinkable. It was not just a title, it was his identity. His refusal, and Blanca's, was absolute. The consequences were immediate and severe. By refusing to sign, they were now enemies of the state, exiles by law. They were forced to leave the land their family had ruled for 600 years. Leopold Salvator, the general who had fought for Austria, the inventor who had modernized its army, was now a refugee. The family, with its 10 children, was forced to relocate, eventually settling in Barcelona, Spain. This was a logical, if bittersweet, choice. It was the homeland of Infanta Blanca's ancestors, a place where the Carlist connection still offered some meager protection and familiarity. But the life they found there was a mockery of their past. They moved from the sprawling 80-servant-staffed world of the Palais Toscana and Schloss Wilhelminenburg to a modest house. The opulent properties they left behind were immediately seized, carved up, and repurposed by the new republic. The magnificent Palais Toscana was subdivided, its grand ballrooms turned into offices and apartments. Schloss Wilhelminenburg was eventually taken over by the city, and in a painfully ironic twist, would later become a children's home. The symbols of their bygone grandeur were unceremoniously dismantled, their private life picked apart by the state. The financial struggles were profound and immediate. Their vast land-based wealth was gone, seized. The imperial stipends they had lived on were gone, abolished. They were, for the first time in their lives, poor. But Leopold was not like his other relatives. He had a weapon they did not, his own mind. The income from his technical patents, the four-wheel drive system, the artillery modifications, the torpedo refinements, was still being paid by companies like Škoda, which were now in the new country of Czechoslovakia. This income, born of his own ingenuity, was the only thing that stood between his family and total destitution. It was a crucial but insufficient lifeline. The cost of maintaining his remaining non-seized properties, like Castle Herrnstein, which he still technically owned, and his share in another castle, was immense. These properties, now in a foreign country, were a liability, not an asset. And the costs of exile for a family of 12 were staggering. Faced with this new harsh reality, Leopold Salvator did something that, more than anything else, illustrates the catastrophic nature of his fall. Before the collapse, in a last-ditch attempt to adapt to the changing political climate and perhaps shield some of his assets, he had pragmatically adopted the bourgeois, non-royal name Leopold Wölfling. Now he tried to become the man his new name suggested. In a desperate bid to maintain some income and put food on the table, Leopold Wölfling, the former Archduke, Prince of Tuscany, Knight of the Golden Fleece, and Inspector General, attempted to open a small grocery store near Vienna during one of his brief permitted returns to the country. One must pause to truly absorb the profound tragedy of this image. Imagine an archduke born in a palace, a man who had commanded armies, a man whose hands were accustomed to technical blueprints, and the velvet of a royal court, now standing behind a wooden counter, personally weighing out flour and selling provisions to commoneers. The venture, as it turned out, was a catastrophic failure. It collapsed not for lack of business, but for too much of the wrong kind. The public, whipped into a frenzy by the press, could not resist the spectacle. They came in droves, not to buy groceries, but to gawk. They came to stare at the Archduke grocer, a living, breathing symbol of the old world's humiliation. The intense, morbid curiosity surrounding the former prince, who had become a tradesman, made any normal business impossible. He was a circus attraction, and he was forced to close the shop, his dignity and his finances taking yet another heavy blow. This single failed endeavor was a poignant and powerful symbol of the Habsburgs' decline. It was the ultimate, almost absurd illustration of the fall from imperial luxury to the harsh reality of everyday labor. The challenges were relentless. As he tried to manage his fragmenting finances, dividing his time between Vienna, where he was now a mere and often unwelcome Mr. Wölfling, and his family's exile in Spain, tragedy struck. In 1930, his son Rainer, just 30 years old, died. The cause is not widely recorded, but the blow to the close-knit family and to the aging patriarch was devastating. That same year, Leopold himself was nearly killed. While driving, he was involved in a severe automobile accident. The initial reports were so grim that he was, for a time, reported dead. While he survived, the event and its injuries severely weakened his already declining health. He was a man in his late 60s, worn down by a world war, the loss of his empire, the humiliation of his exile, the failure of his business, and the death of his son. The Inventor Prince, the man who had championed the motorization of the army, was now broken by one of the very machines he had embraced. This staggering fall from a palace to a failed grocery shop is a powerful symbol, but it only captures the external circumstances of his collapse. To truly understand Leopold Salvator, one must look beyond the humiliation of his exile and his financial ruin. What kind of man was he, at his core, to endure such a fate? His resilience, his pragmatism, and his unbending pride defined his final years. Yet these very qualities were not enough to save his name from a new political enemy, history itself. As he faced his final illness, a concerted effort was already underway to erase the man who had been a pioneer, a general, and a prince. What kind of man, then, was this Archduke Leopold Salvator? As the 1930s dawned and his life entered its final painful chapter, the full complex portrait of his character came into sharp focus. He was, above all, a man of profound contradictions, a perfect embodiment of the dying, changing world he was born into. He was scientifically inclined to a degree that was almost unheard of in his rarefied circle. He possessed one of the most genuinely creative and technical royal minds of his generation. This was not a dilettante's hobby. He was a serious, patented inventor whose work had real-world strategic impact. He was deeply adventurous, as evidenced by his pioneering balloon flights. He was not a man to sit in a stuffy palace. He was driven to test boundaries, to rise above the earth, and to master the technologies of the future. He was remarkably resilient and pragmatic. When his world of unimaginable privilege was violently ripped away, he did not simply collapse into despair, as many of his contemporaries did. He adapted. He fell back on his work ethic, his bourgeois adopted name of Wölfling, and the income from his own patents. The grocery store, while a public humiliation and a financial failure, was an act of profound, if desperate, pragmatism. He was a prince willing to work with his hands to feed his family. And yet, he was also a man of unbending principle. The very pragmatism that allowed him to open a shop was bounded by a core, aristocratic pride that could not allow him to renounce his name, his title, and his heritage. He would rather be an exiled grocer named Wölfling than a wealthy private citizen in Vienna who had signed a paper betraying his ancestors. So why is such an extraordinary, complex figure, a pioneer aviator, a military innovator, a prince inventor, so largely forgotten today? Why is he a mere footnote while his kinsman, the remote and conventional emperor Franz Joseph, remains the very symbol of the era? Several factors, all converging at once, conspired to erase Leopold Salvator from the pages of history. First, he was eclipsed by the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe he was part of. The fall of the 600-year-old Habsburg Empire, the redrawing of the entire map of Europe, the deaths of 20 million people in a great war. These are events so colossal that they create their own gravity, pulling all light toward them. The story became the end of the empire, a grand impersonal tragedy that had no room for the story of one man's four-wheel drive patent. Second, his inventions, while incredibly impactful for their time, lacked the romanticized glamour that ensures a place in the popular imagination. The Wright brothers' first flight is a man-on-the-moon moment, a poetic image of humanity taking wing. Leopold Salvator's work, artillery tractors, mine warfare techniques, and improved torpedoes was gritty, military, and technical. It was the vital, greasy pipework of war, not the soaring poetry of flight. History remembers the airplane, not the artillery spotter who perfected its military use. Third, he was overshadowed by family scandals that were, frankly, more interesting to the press. While Leopold was struggling to manage his remaining assets, his son, Leopold Jr., was providing endless fodder for the tabloids. Having immigrated to the United States, Leopold Jr. tried to live a normal life, even working in a Connecticut factory. But he soon became embroiled in a peculiar and very public dispute over the sale of a priceless Habsburg necklace, the Order of the Golden Fleece, in the 1930s. This story of a penniless prince in America, part scandal and part fairy tale, was far more captivating to the public than the complex legacy of his scientist father. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, his erasure was deliberate and political. The new republics that rose from the ashes of the empire, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, were built on a foundation of anti-Habsburg sentiment. They needed to create new national identities, and to do that, they had to systematically diminish, ridicule, or erase the achievements of the imperial past. Leopold Salvator was a Habsburg, and therefore his contributions were, by definition, part of the old corrupt regime. His reputation as a scientist and inventor, which was highly regarded in royal and military circles before the war, was now an inconvenient truth. It was easier to relegate him and all his work to the dustbin of history. And so the man who had soared in balloons, commanded armies, and designed the future of transport found himself in his final days a weakened, ailing, and forgotten man. Archduke Leopold Salvator passed away on September 4th, 1931, at the age of 67. He died in a Vienna sanitarium, the city that had been his home and had ultimately rejected him. His prolonged illness, exacerbated by the severe injuries from his car accident the previous year, had finally overwhelmed his resilient spirit. He was not alone. In his final moments, he was attended by the family that had been his one true anchor, his devoted wife Infanta Blanca, who had been his partner through imperial glory and desperate exile, his son Leopold Jr., the American prince, who had returned from the New World to be by his father's side, and his daughter-in-law Dagmar. In a final poignant testament to the very technology he had championed, his son Anton and his new wife, Princess Ileana of Romania, whom he had married just months earlier, arrived by airplane. Fresh from their honeymoon, they had taken to the skies, using the mode of transport Leopold had pioneered decades earlier in his balloon, to reach his deathbed in time. The Inventor Prince, who had begun his career in a wicker basket under a silk balloon, was seen off from this world by a son who could now cross a continent in a machine with wings. He was laid to rest in the Capuchin crypt in Vienna, the traditional solemn burial place of the Habsburgs for over 300 years. He was interred alongside his ancestors and, tragically, alongside his son Rainer, who had predeceased him by a year. The new Republican Austria, which had banished him in life, permitted him in death to return to the cold, stone embrace of his dynasty, one last emperor's son, laid to rest in the twilight of their long imperial day. Leopold Salvator was laid to rest in the Capuchin crypt, but his story did not end there. What he left behind for the world was a two-sided irony, an ending both tragic and deeply poignant. On one hand, there was his brilliant mind. His inventions endured. His patents, like the revolutionary four-wheel drive system, were not bound by politics. They were simply excellent engineering. They survived quietly, absorbed by companies like Skoda and becoming part of the DNA of modern machinery, but completely detached from the name of the prince who had created them. His military doctrines became standard, yet his name was deliberately erased. On the other hand, and perhaps more tragically, there was his family. This was the ultimate tragedy. His bloodline, once the center of imperial grandeur, was now scattered to the four winds. His 10 children were a living diaspora, a shattered symbol of the empire's collapse. They traded palaces for factory work in America, fled new wars in Spain, and married commoners in Texas. The Habsburgs, who had once ruled a continent, were now refugees. History, written as it is by the victors, had no room for a brilliant Habsburg innovator. His name was simply swallowed by the fall of the empire he had tried to save. He was the last of his kind, a prince who lived by his mind, a man who saw the future, and a general who was, in the end, consumed by the past.